some version of history that's led to the prohibition of marijuana in the United States. It's an understatement to say that the 20th century has been suspicious of the plant, but I never thought about what created that skepticism in light of our new understanding about the medicinal value of the herb. Decades of anti-marijuana propaganda and the reefer madness movement generated a lot of the distrust toward the cannabis plant. Even supporters of broad reform will admit that there's been a subculture of marijuana users who have added to its bad reputation. In 1970, these fears culminated with the Controlled Substance Act, which was signed into law by President Nixon. The law classified marijuana as a Schedule I drug alongside heroin, LSD, and ecstasy. According to the federal government, a Schedule I drug is a substance with no recognized medical application and a high potential for abuse. Under this law, it's also illegal to test a Schedule I drug for medical properties, which has prevented any relevant studies for several decades. This means that universities or hospitals choosing to conduct this type of research could potentially lose their federal funding. In the final years of the 20th century, a state came along that challenged the federal classification of marijuana. California became the first state to officially recognize the benefits of this natural substance, and in 1996, they put the issue on the ballot. Proposition 215 passed by a public vote with over 55% support. In the last 20 years, a total of 23 states and Washington, D.C. have enacted what are known as comprehensive medical marijuana programs. In order to be considered comprehensive, a state's law must protect from criminal penalties, allow access in the state with a variety of strains, and allow smoking or vaporizing of full plant or full plant extract. It may not be surprising that none of these states are in the South where marijuana laws are strict, but some states have been able to address the medical issue without involving recreational marijuana. There are nearly a dozen additional states that have enacted laws decriminalizing cannabis oil, low in THC, and used specifically to treat seizures, cancer, and other health issues like MS. Though these laws differ greatly from state to state, the underlying fact is that legislation exists that can protect families from prosecution, even though they're still breaking federal laws and risking federal prosecution. We began this project to find out how effective this treatment was for patients with epilepsy in Colorado, and why citizens of Georgia were being denied access if the claims were true. All of the states that share a border with Georgia have addressed this issue with limited legislation, so what's happening in Atlanta that makes this option wrong for patients in Georgia? All of this isn't to say there's no support for reform in the Peach State. In March of 2014, House Bill 885 would have given parents in possession of cannabis oil protection from arrest in Georgia. It passed the Georgia House 171-4 and unanimously in the Georgia Senate. Still, the legislative session ended with no change to Georgia law. This has created a transition for many families to states that offer relief. Right now, there is new hope for those suffering. It's just not in Georgia. Several nearby states have decriminalized cannabis oil, but they lack the infrastructure to obtain the medication in state, again because of federal prohibition. So these families are forced to split up, leave their doctors and communities, and quit their jobs, all in order to gain access to an oil extracted from the cannabis plant. This didn't make sense to us and seemed unfair to so many people in our state. We began our investigation back in March, right after the bill was held hostage on the last day of the session.
House Bill 885. Chair recognizes Representative Peak to present the bill. Representative Peak.
Here to present to you House Bill 885, Haley's Hope Act. We need access to this medical cannabis for Georgia families. That's the reason for HB 885. We as a chamber are committed to finding solutions for Georgia families, not putting up further obstacles to block their path. I bring before you, for the last time, a shot at giving hope to families here in Georgia. Folks, this would provide parents or an individual who has obtained cannabidiol oil legally in another state with protection from arrest and prosecution for possession while in Georgia. To my colleagues in the Senate, if they can hear me, I beg you to have compassion and courage to do what this body has already done twice and vote for this bill. Hope for these families. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield the way.
With the number of people affected by epilepsy in Georgia, the state's representatives are well aware of the situation families are facing, and many of them are willing to talk about why they support the legislation.
I'm David Ralston. I'm the Speaker of the House here in the state of Georgia. I represent a very conservative district in Georgia, and I've had nothing but positive feedback, very positive feedback here in the state for the medical cannabis bill.
We have the ability to look at the states around us and across the United States and determine what's worked and what hasn't worked. My hope is that we come out with a better bill than what we might have had last year with House Bill 885. I think we can get a better bill. I think we can probably help more people. The urgency is now.
We have to do our duty in the legislature to fix this for these families. The most frustrating part was getting so close. Every piece of legislation has to go through so many hoops and hurdles before it ever reaches the floor for a vote. That process takes a long time. And when you get so close to a victory, frankly, it would have been a great victory for the children of Georgia. It's disheartening, it's a gut punch, it hurts.
Most of these children have been having seizures for an extended period of time, and every time they have a seizure, it does a little more damage to their brain. And so that's why the sense of urgency was there, that we needed to do something now. I literally went on the Senate floor and begged the Lieutenant Governor. I begged this particular senator who had held it hostage, and they refused. Now, I think in hindsight, most folks realize that that was a big mistake, and that should have never happened.
I think the most frustrating part was seeing this House of Representatives lead in a very strong way, taking a new idea, passing it with overwhelming support, and then having the bill kind of get caught up in the legislative process and not become law. You know, that was very frustrating to me. And it was emotional for one reason: hope. These families had hope. This was a real priority for the House. The Senate had other priorities. And I think that, at the end of the day, was what prevented the measure from passing last year.
This is not the legalization of a recreational drug. This is a new form of medicine that can save people's lives, that can give them a better quality of life. And I cannot for the life of me understand why anyone would be against helping a fellow citizen, another human being, if indeed we can.
It's incumbent upon our society and us as individuals to seek remedies for those that are in need. That is what representing the people is about. And when you take that oath, you don't take the oath to represent the Republicans or the Democrats or the Libertarians or the Tea Parties or the able or the disabled. You take that oath to represent everyone. When you say who opposed it, it passed the Senate 53-0. That is the great frustration in what we do as legislators, when you know what's right, you know what's good, you know what's beneficial, and sometimes you can't get it done.
We have to do something that doesn't turn our law-abiding citizens into criminals. And if they came back to Georgia and we don't have a law that addresses the need, that's what we're going to do. These are not criminals. These are families that have nowhere else to go. These are families that need medicine for their children. Plain and simple.
From my interaction with Georgia's elected officials, I could tell that there was legislative support for a medicinal marijuana program in the state, but I didn't really understand the urgency until I met some of the families fighting for access to cannabis oil. In July, I was introduced to Sebastian and Annette Cott, who want the option to treat their son Jagger with cannabis oil in Georgia. Jagger suffers from a rare terminal form of mitochondrial disease called Lee's disease. On top of all the seizures, this genetic disorder affects his heart and his digestive and respiratory systems because his body doesn't produce enough energy for the functions you and I take for granted.
We handle over 100 syringes a day. And we calculate if we do that 300 times a year, because we are in the hospital about 50 days a year, we handle over 30,000 syringes a year. This is methadone, so it's not a drug you should be on for a very long time. But we're using this for his pain control.
And the methadone treatment can also cause him to get hooked on it, or his body.
Oh, he's absolutely hooked on it. I mean, he's hooked on Valium, he's hooked on methadone, without a doubt. And he's been on it for so long, it's in his body, so he needs it just to function every day. Some days he sleeps 20, 22 hours a day, and we can wake him up.
That monitors his oxygen levels in his blood and his heart rate. 100 is the maximum, and anything below 90 gets critical.
And that's his BiPAP machine. He has to have this mask on every night to sleep. He has to get breathing treatment 3 times a day. But after that, we put him on a machine called the vest, which is this machine right here.
If we don't do any of this, his breath will become very shallow, his oxygen levels will go down, and we will be in the hospital with pneumonia.
So, I mean, just between the treatment and the meds, you're looking at a full-time job right there. Because he can't live without it. So can you imagine trying to move to Orvis to Colorado? Or to any other state?
That day when they didn't pass it showed me that they did not understand. They were willing to gamble with our lives and our emotions and our children's lives. The ones that ultimately had the power, they didn't care.
At this point, Annette and Sebastian were considering their options. The trip to Colorado would not just be difficult, it could be life-threatening for Jagger. The equipment he needs to survive isn't allowed on a commercial flight, and some of it's owned by the hospital, which means they wouldn't be able to carry it with them out of the state. There's also the possibility that they could arrive in Denver and not find the same relief that other patients experience. I wondered what choice I would make in that situation. The preparations for a trip like that seemed endless. It didn't take long to wonder, why should anyone have to make that choice at all? Jagger's condition requires him to take many dangerous seizure suppressants called benzodiazepines, which are addictive and extremely intoxicating, and he's often prescribed opiates for pain. One reason the Cotts are seeking cannabis oil is for the pain relief that THC could provide without the side effects of the harsh pharmaceuticals. Since THC is the ingredient that can be considered intoxicating, the exact level allowed in the medication in Georgia is controversial. But the truth is, it's much more complicated than 1 or 2 particular compounds that may intoxicate a patient. THC is the property that may get a marijuana user high, but it's one of several hundred puzzle pieces found in the cannabis plant that make the treatment effective. Some patients respond well to low THC strands. Others require slightly higher levels of THC. In Colorado, those ratios are not restricted, and that made the difference when they decided to join another family who had made the journey.
Haley's 4. She started having seizures at about 8 months old. So she was diagnosed with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which is just intractable seizures that can't be controlled with medication. On January 10th was Haley's turning point. I had Haley on the vest and doing a breathing treatment while I was getting her ready for bed. And when I came back to her, she was in her chair and she was blue. She wasn't breathing at all. So she was just lifeless. Her pulse was beating as fast as it could, and I knew her heart was fixing to give out. And at that moment, I figured my child's going to die, and all because of epilepsy. It was just the start of our nightmare. We stayed in the PICU for 2.5 months, and Haley continued to quit breathing. Doctors were giving us, maybe 6 months more to live, and her seizures were just getting worse and worse. They had pretty much told us there was nothing else they could do. I mean, they sent us home, they discharged us from the hospital when she was still continuing to quit breathing. So when I got home, I was still having to do CPR on my child to make sure that she continued to keep breathing. Nothing worked, so to come here and be on a natural plant that is actually changing her life for the better, it's amazing. We were very cautious when we moved out here, but we had to try it. And when we first moved here for the CBD, we were not as hopeful as so many families because we've been on everything that they said was supposed to work and nothing's ever worked. Getting Haley on a plane was extremely hard because she really wasn't stable, but we had no other way of getting her to Colorado safely. So we were able to get on the plane. She would quit breathing, so we would have to figure out a way to get her started back again, and then she would just seize constantly. I think she had about 300 seizures plus on the plane. So it was extremely emotional. My husband drove. He packed up our house and we put it all in the back of the car and he drove over here. We had about a week with him while we were here, and then he had to leave and we had no clue the next time we were going to see him again. Being so far away from each other is horrible. It's horrible. I don't want any other families to have to feel that pain. Before we started the medicine, Haley was having 200 plus seizures a day. She was maxed out on 4 different seizure medications, so she was extremely shut down. She pretty much would just lay there. She wouldn't move, she wouldn't talk, she wouldn't even make eye contact. She never smiled. After about the second dose, her seizures were cut dramatically, and we were only seeing maybe 50 a day. And all of a sudden, my husband was holding her at one point, and she just looked up and she just smiled. And it wasn't one of those seizure smiles that she usually has. It was a real smile that she was happy, and she was happy where she was. I would love for it to be decriminalized because that would bring me back home to my family, my friends. But if I would have stayed in Georgia, my child probably would have been dead. I can honestly say that Haley's Hope and the Flowering Hope Foundation saved my child's life. That is a fact. It never would have happened without this medication.
Not only are Sebastian and Janaea faced with obstacles related directly to their children's health, in their fight for cannabis oil, they have seen special interests play a role in preventing access to this medicine in Georgia. Like it or not, the war on drugs has become extremely profitable, and our law enforcement programs account for millions of jobs across the country. In 2012, more than 48% of all drug-related arrests were for simple marijuana possession. That's revenue from 658,000 people that our private prisons and police unions have grown to depend on. This isn't any more about marijuana than prescription drugs derived from opium plants are about heroin, but the stigma over the cannabis plant still clouds this debate. Changes to the status of marijuana prohibition, even enough to study its medicinal value, could have serious economic implications that state governments aren't ready to accept or don't fully understand. There are other considerations, like the pharmaceutical companies potentially losing billions if the claims about cannabis oil are true. It's also in the best interest of the powerful alcohol industry to keep any competition illegal. There's tobacco and timber lobbyists that are happy to see hemp remain a Schedule I drug, and on top of that, there are worries that a bill passed in Georgia might not make its way past the governor's desk. I don't want to suggest that there aren't serious concerns regarding the manufacture, regulation, and infrastructure involved with this medicine, and I won't ignore the real concerns that need to be addressed by law enforcement and the medical community, but half the country already handles it effectively. All of these roadblocks stand in the way of reform that most of the people in our country and most of the people in our state support, but passing legislation isn't that easy.
We know that a lot of her delays and difficulties are a result of the syndrome, but there's no denying that the biggest toll is from the medications themselves. I've got bottles of medication over there in my cabinet that have FDA warning labels on it telling me how dangerous they are and that they could kill my child. So how is it different for me to try something that we may or may not know if it could harm her when she's taking 13 pills a day that we know have the potential to do serious long-term damage?
Yeah, but they tell us it's okay to take because the FDA's approved it and just told you how bad it is.
And look at all the FDA drugs that get approved and then later taken off the market because people are dying and getting sick, and then they realize, like, oh, maybe we were wrong. Maybe that wasn't so safe.
My name's Christy Baggerly, and I live in Cumming, Georgia. I have a 3-year-old daughter, Kendall Baggerly, who could use cannabis oil for her seizures. She has a diagnosis called Aicardi syndrome. The 2 medications available are ACTH, which is a steroid. Death is definitely an option with ACTH.
There you go. Good job, Kendall.
The other option we had was a new drug. None of her other doctors had heard of it. It's called Sabril, and it has a 30% risk of blindness. We've heard so many people say they don't want our kids to be guinea pigs, but with FDA medications, that's all our kids are guinea pigs. We're just trying to find out what FDA medications are working and at what dosage is best, and nobody knows for sure. So I don't understand where cannabis oil would be any different.
Those are the drugs our children are on. Now, what is one of the arguments that you've heard, and you guys heard them from the legislators? They're worried about this being a bridge, a gateway into legalization of medical marijuana, and they're worried about medical marijuana being a gateway into other drugs like benzos and opiates. Can we step back? Would it be okay if we would take our child off of the drugs they're trying to protect us from so that we can try something that's a little bit more harmless, that could potentially have a huge impact on the quality of her life? There's no logic in the argument there.
Yeah, that's a real drug. I mean, the things that were scary, the scary real drugs that you would be afraid of, it's a benzo. Fortunately, it's what works. But yeah, these are scary real drugs. If you look at me personally, this is a non-FDA approved drug, right? And so I personally don't think that I'm assuming any additional risk by giving a CBD versus this. It's the same. So if I'm allowed to do this now, importing it from France, why can't I get something that I know works as well from Colorado?
Well, look at what it is approved: OxyContin, Prozac, Xanax. I mean, all that is approved. You can go to a doctor and get it, but it's way more dangerous than taking cannabis.
I've been a nurse more than I've been a mom, and that's been a big part of raising Henry. And I wouldn't change a thing, because God, this child has taught me how to live. He's taught me that life is a little bit about one day at a time. You should really be present in today, because we don't ever know how long Henry's going to be with us. And I kiss him before I go to bed, as most mothers do, but when I kiss my child before I go to bed, I kiss him on his forehead and pray that tomorrow morning he'll still be here, because there's always a really good chance that he might not be. And so when I think about the opportunity and why Ross and I have spent so much time being so passionate about giving people a choice with CBD, it's because no mother should ever know that they could have made a better choice to keep their child alive or well or improve their set of circumstances, and they didn't take it.
We've used every medication out there that's available for her. She's been on medications that we had to sign a medical waiver. She was on Felbitol, and we had to sign a waiver saying we wouldn't sue the hospital and the doctor if she died.
If you want absolute seizure control with medication, you can medicate to the point where it's almost like the child's in a medicated coma. But is that what you want for your child? The answer is no. You want your child to have life and have activity and to be engaged.
My daughter has been on 13 different seizure medicines. They're addictive. They're very hard to wean the children off. If you think it's drastic to put your child on medical cannabis, I invite anybody to spend a day with us to see what Trinity goes through. We can't wait any longer. That's why we're here in Colorado, because we had no other options. My child is as important to me as any other child. And I couldn't look my child in the face every day knowing that there was something out there that could help her. The night that the bill didn't pass, I had to come home with tears in my eyes and look at my child having seizures. And I just broke down and cried, and I just held her and I said, I'm going to do what I can to get you some help, Trinity. That's all I can do as a parent.
We went actually 56 days without a seizure one time. and it was during the time we was using Kepra. But when they came back with a vengeance. They was 2 to 5 a day again. We've been off of medication. Sydney's been off pharmaceuticals or FDA-approved drugs for about 5 to 6 years now. We have been, since then, we've been 10 days without a seizure. But we have no side effects with the natural medicine. That's the good part. She's not lethargic. We're not having to go to the hospital and let them check the liver enzymes, drawing blood, doing urine samples. We're not having to do any of that. There's no side effects. I mean, it's filtered through the body naturally. After we had a video EEG in Scottish Rite, the protocol was to remove the meds to provoke a seizure and to capture it on video. At that time, Sydney sat in the bed with the playing. She sort of come alive. She would make eye contact. I think it was a combination of all the side effects of all the medications, the FDA-approved drugs. It didn't help Sydney. She was existing. She wasn't living. I mean, and the doctor told us at one time, and it still sticks in my brain today, sometimes you have to weigh out the quality of life.
They're doing it in the only way they can with the federal laws that are in place. I mean, they're actually coming forward with a medicine. Now, it's not a medicine that a lot of people have faith in because it's only just one part of the plan. Now, it may help children, it may not. In fact, we've seen that it actually is helping some children in the trials that they're doing. It's just we can't get people into the trials because of the federal regulations that are in place. And even if we could get people into the trials, again, it's only one type of medicine that's pulling only one component of the plant, when there's all the other parts of the plant that could be used as well. So again, I mean, it is one option, but it's a very limited option.
I don't think people understand what it's like with a child that has seizures. It changes everybody's life. It changes the life of their siblings. It changes the life of their parents. It changes the lives of their grandparents. It breaks your heart. You're talking about 5 children that their whole lives have been disrupted. I mean, we don't get to see them. Why would anybody come against that? I don't understand it. I mean, I don't. I've not talked to a friend, whether they be liberal, conservative, Democratic, Republican, independent, libertarian. I don't care. They all see this. Close your eyes and picture your child. Picture your child falling all over, knocking her teeth out, blacking her eyes. Picture your child. What would you do if it was your child?
The people that say this are the people that don't know. They don't know what it is. They hear it's an extract of marijuana and that's it. Don't want to hear any more about it. We can't legalize that here. They don't know what they're talking about, basically.
As a grandparent, you not only see the child suffer a little bit, but we see from afar, we see what it's does to the family, and it's difficult. Some of the choices that they have to make, those are just gut-wrenching decisions we see them have to make, and all they want is some help for their child.
For us, we'd love for them to be able to stay in the state of Georgia. They contribute a lot to our congregation. We'd like them to have a trial that makes sense medically, that makes sense legally. So, you know, I'm not opposed to regulations around it, but where they get access without a long wait. If you don't have a child with some ongoing illness, you can't really relate. You know, we take a lot for granted. So anything we can do as a society to help them, I think that's, you know, where our values should be, you know, as far as family values. How can we help them face the situation in a way that's moral?
And one thing I would add, and I left out, so this church that we're sitting in right now, the family, the support that we have here is just phenomenal. This is our family. This is our church. It's our rock. And you know, without that, we would struggle.
Another point of view is to understand the compassion element in our society. The best part of our society And especially if you know the stories of people like Kendall, I think we'll make the right decision. And that's to allow this and allow it to help people and then to be monitored and see how the effects are over time.
Several legislatures understand the situation. They understand that it's tough to get it and it's not available here, and encourage us to just go out and get it and bring it back. And we don't want to have to do that. We're law-abiding citizens and we want to do the right thing. We're just asking for an opportunity for this medicine to be available to the families here in Georgia. Just to lose them being around here would hurt a lot, you know. It's really hard to sit and watch them have to struggle with these decisions.
It's not just my family that's affected by epilepsy. And it's not just children who struggle with the medications. Our extended families suffer as well. Victoria's brothers suffer by losing their mom and their sister, and I'm forced to separate from my husband indefinitely. We know that none of these pharmaceutical medications provide the seizure control we need. No parent, no caregiver that I know of believes that this is a miracle drug that's going to cure our children of epilepsy. None of the parents I know think that this treatment will be the end to this difficult disease. But we can't overstate that it's a natural option that's working. It's safe, and it can provide a quality of life for our children above and beyond the options available to us now. We're asking our representatives and our communities to support this because we are out of options. We'd love to see an end to federal prohibition, but until then, we need an option in Georgia so that I don't have to miss my son's baseball games to get my daughter's seizures under control.
You two look like trouble.
I shouldn't have to miss my husband's birthday or our anniversary in order to have access to a harmless and natural substance. No family should have to. The frustrating thing is that we're not asking a lot. And on the other hand, families like mine are asked to move across the country away from our support networks that we rely on. We're waiting to see our families, waiting to get back to our jobs, and most of all, we're waiting for our state to bring us home to the churches and communities where we belong. Even if a bill is passed next legislative session, whether it's January, February, March of 2015, it could still be 18 months before we even have access to the medicine here in Georgia. Between now and then, families will either be forced to watch helplessly as their children have dozens of seizures per day while battling the pharmaceuticals, or watch their own families grow apart living 1,500 miles away. In Colorado, we had significant seizure control. Since we've been back in Georgia, she's fallen back into her old routine without cannabis oil. Call it anecdotal if you want to, but this medicine is working, and it worked for my daughter. We're just asking to have this option available in Georgia. I've still never heard anyone explain how this legislation could hurt our family or our community.
When I get a phone call that she's back in the ER, it kills my soul. I'm thinking that's going to be the last call, you know. I'm just so sad. I'm just torn. It's not fair that my child has to leave, and I'm mad. She's having to leave her boys and her husband, seeing the bags packed. It's real. We're having to leave.
All of these families fight the same battle against seizure disorders, but they face unique challenges depending on their set of circumstances. A diagnosis can range from Dravet syndrome to mitochondrial disease to autism, and that's where the story gets complicated. It's often reported that HB 885 failed in Georgia last session, but that isn't exactly true. The bill passed both houses with only 4 total votes against it. So why didn't HB 885 become law?
The Senate attached the autism coverage.
And the autism coverage alone was the only thing that...
Yep, if they had not attached the autism coverage, it would have passed. That was the catch. I mean, that was the hang-up. The autism coverage was the hang-up. It should not have been.
But what ended up happening is there wasn't that support in the House for that particular autism bill, and as a result, in effect, the medical cannabis bill was held hostage, and ultimately, in a poor show of political gamemanship, the bill was not voted on again, and it died.
There was obviously undeniable support for the bill, so much that the autism insurance coverage mandate got attached to ours because they thought it would be a sure way to get theirs in. Unfortunately, in the final hours when our bill was pulled back off separately, the Senate wasn't willing to address ours separately. And we were there at the Capitol until 12 a.m. that final night, waiting, even in those last few minutes, hoping that Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle would step in and say, you know what, let's do the right thing. If we can't help all the kids, let's at least help these sick children be able to get access to this medicine and come home. And we were incredibly disappointed when they didn't do that.
I mean, it was two completely unrelated pieces of legislation that, for only political reasons, they put together in one bill. So, I mean, they were playing politics with our kids.
They're separate ideas, and they ought to be evaluated on their own merits. They're too important for that. My hope is that each of those measures can be debated on its own, considered on its own, and voted up or down on its own. Those advocating for the medical cannabis bill are simply wanting an opportunity. They're not asking for funding. They're not asking for a subsidy, or they're not asking for anything other than the opportunity to seek treatment. That's a little different than the other issue. I think we ought not be talking about looking for ways to merge, but we ought to be talking about debating the bills on their own merits, independently, one from the other.
The biggest thing that we need to happen is actually get a supply of medicine here in Georgia. And the only way to do that right now with the federal laws is to grow it in our state.
I think first and foremost, it's to do some type of decriminalization to bring the families in Colorado home. They need to know that they can bring the medicine back here, and while it still may be illegal to take it across state lines federally, if they're willing to take that risk, they need to know that when they get back here, they don't have to worry about DFACs knocking on their door or the cops showing up and throwing them in jail just for simply having the medicine. So that really is the first step. And then after that, it will be looking at what kind of a comprehensive program can we get to help as many people as possible.
We're not asking for, what Colorado has from recreational, what Washington has from recreational. We're asking to get the right medicine to the right people. That's really it.
So many states have passed legislation that they aren't able to implement because of federal issues. Like Kentucky is growing marijuana, but they can't give it to the kids that need it. It's just like our state. We can possess it, but where are we going to get it from? We didn't go home completely empty-handed, but, do I have medicine I can give my child? We still have to get to that point.
With the deck stacked against them, these Georgia families have two key supporters that may turn the tide in their favor. The first is Jason Cranford, a Georgia native who serves as a caregiver to over 90 patients in Colorado. His passion for this cause has led him to breed plants with the specific components that help with seizure suppression. This process can take years, and that hard work has paid off for the patients Jason treats.
This is a machine that makes all the extracts for the pediatric epilepsy patients. It's a real simple, basic design that uses heat and a small pump to extract the cannabinoids. It runs off of vegetable oils like canola, safflower, hemp oil. It's a 100% organic process with organic plant material and organic safflower oil. These vials get filled up with the oil, the solvent. These two tubes get filled up with the plant material. We turn the heat on until we hit our target temp. Then we turn the pump on, and then we open up the chambers with these valves right here. At the end of the process, it fills this tank with a filtered oil that is the actual medicine. And here's a bottle of that. So the end product is just a really clean, organic solvent. All of these strains in this greenhouse have been collected and bred specifically for CBD content. And this strain in particular is the Haley's Hope. So the predominant cannabinoids in this plant are non-intoxicating. The THC would be the smallest cannabinoid found in the plant. The parents that I usually deal with are at the end of their rope. They're extremely desperate. They've exhausted all pharmaceutical medicines and nothing stopped the seizures. They've tried everything and nothing's been successful. Cannabidiol remains a Schedule I controlled substance with the DEA and the federal government. So therefore, this non-intoxicating product non-lethal product is still illegal in Georgia. So the access is the number one problem for the parents in Georgia. They basically have to sell their homes, quit their jobs, split their families, and move halfway across the country to save their children's life. And it's because of poor legislation.
The biggest player in all of this is State Representative Alan Peake, author of HB 885. Late in the game, he turned this idea into a piece of legislation that would have at least granted these families protection from prosecution if they had cannabis oil in Georgia. When the bill died on the House floor, he decided to create the Journey of Hope, a nonprofit that assists families with travel and housing expenses if they need to relocate to access cannabis oil. Alan Peake has a difficult job in the coming session. Crafting a new bill won't be easy. Over the past several weeks, he's been holding public panel meetings across Georgia with law enforcement and medical professionals, as well as patients and parents who seek this treatment in-state. A bill too broad will lose support in a conservative state like Georgia, and laws that limit medication to CBD only ignore the fact that THC, as controversial as it may be, is an essential ingredient in this medicine.
Well, I think, one, we got to make sure it's safe. So we're providing a safe product to our citizens. I think that's first and foremost. I think we've got to make sure that we do it cost effective, that we are able to provide cannabis oil in a method that can reach all citizens. I think we need to do something, draft legislation that can move quickly. You know, we don't need to set up a structure that's going to take 2 or 3 years to get in place. We need to draft something that, okay, we set up the infrastructure, we set up the rules and regulations, and we start growing. We grow the product here in Georgia and process it here and distribute it here. I think it's got to be safe, it's got to be effective, it's got to be timely. And I think if we meet those 3 criteria, we'll draft some good legislation.
So my name is Dr. Terry Mark Himes. I've been practicing clinical neurology now for approximately 30 years. The great majority of children that have moved to Colorado because of this problem are in absolute dire straits by the time they get here. They have already been through conventional diagnosis and treatment modalities. I think that the safety issue of the other medicines have to be seen in context with what CBD offers. The major concern is usually that we're going to stop the child from breathing with these other conventional pharmaceutical drugs. Cannabinoids don't appear to have any significant effect on the respiratory system at all. Everything has to be taken into context, and THC in low quantities is not much to be concerned about in contrast to all the other issues.
So let's look at what we know. Marijuana being classified as a Schedule I drug was at best misguided. Nobody engaged in this issue denies that at this point. But unfortunately, due to federal gridlock, it looks like it's stuck that way. The only good news is that so far states are being allowed to take action on their own, despite federal prohibition. In Georgia, reform is overwhelmingly popular among elected officials and voters, but special interests are standing in the way of meaningful legislation that will bring these families home. We know that the old arguments about the levels of THC become negligible when we acknowledge that the patients who need cannabis oil are already taking prescriptions like OxyContin and methadone. Think about that. Now, ideally, no medications, especially those for children, would get the patient high. But the fact is that most of these anti-epileptic drugs are not only getting them extremely high, they can potentially be fatal. This debate is crucial, however, because the levels of THC play an important role in the treatment of other diseases.
We're fighting for a medicine for our child to take so she can have a better life. There are other people fighting for their children. There are other people fighting to make their cancer go away, to help with their glaucoma, to help with MS. It has nothing to do with recreational use whatsoever.
It's a no-brainer because if people are given the opportunity, why in the world would they uproot their families, leave all their support group, and move 2,000 miles away when they could live and work and be close to their families here? I mean, it's an absolute no-brainer.
Yeah, to us, it would mean they could come home.
Yeah.
And that's important because you want your family back.
Sure.
Oh,
absolutely.
sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As
How
I say,
badly do you miss your granddaughter and your grandkids?
I can't tell you how bad. I cannot tell you how bad.
half of it, we have 11 grandchildren. 5 of them are gone.
Yeah, half of them are gone.
I think when you share the stories of these families that come from all those different diverse backgrounds, I think it kind of unites folks and says, hey, let's put our political wrangling aside.
We have to do our duty in the legislature to fix this for these families so they don't have that fear. They shouldn't have that fear.
I think a success is that families that have dealt with this issue in their home for all these many years, to have the ability to get this treatment without fear of prosecution and without having to move to another state, that to me is what would be a success.
If we as a society are worried about the harm that can be done from cannabis oil, we should be equally concerned about the conversations patients have with their doctors every day about the alternative. They are talking about death, overdose, liver damage, hallucinations, decreased organ function, anger, confusion, nearly comatose-like behavior, depression, and fatigue. That's just for anti-epileptic drugs. We all know the right thing to do. The way you can help is to contact your representative. Tell them you support the medical refugees from Georgia and want to bring them home. We cannot move fast enough.